come now to the first of our two keynotes, and Philip has already introduced himself, but perhaps I could say that Philip is Professor of British and Commonwealth History at the University of London, Director of the History and Policy Institute of Historical Research. He's co-chair with me of the Commonwealth Histories of Social Work Steering Group, has had a particular interest in aspects of post-war British decolonialization, particularly in Africa, post-war African politics and the European colonial empires. And he was recently quoted commenting on the royal visit to the Caribbean and the issues that threw up, which are immediate and topical about the history of slavery and reparations, all of those challenges. And we've heard earlier in the Caribbean about some of the social conflicts in the 1940s and the role social work played, positive and negative, in that. So there's a lot to get our teeth into in this history, and Philip is an ideal person to do that. So Philip, thank you so much for all your support for this project, and thank you for giving us this scene-setting keynote. Over to you, Philip.
Thank you, David, and it is I have to say, a great pleasure to be talking on a Commonwealth issue not connected to the royal family at the moment. But I should also say that, unlike all the rest of our speakers today, I'm not a specialist on social work. So what I really want to do in these opening remarks is to try and set some sort of conceptual framework for the ways in which history can possibly help us to develop our thinking around social work and to help practitioners and policymakers. And these are broad issues of principle rather than questions of sort of specific historical fact. I suppose that where we start from really is a kind of in recent years, certainly in the last two decades, a kind of criticism of social work in the Commonwealth based on its colonial origins. And really, though, I just want to sort of start with three recent articles that I came across in my reading. All of them really start with this premise, as the first of these excerpts says, that social work education in this case, is grounded in ideological foundations rooted in the European project of colonial expansion, racist capitalism, and coloniality. And its history is grounded in the social engineering of white supremacy. Next quotation. The exploitation of Western knowledge, values, and belief in social work has not only proven inappropriate for the profession to respond to Indigenous peoples' experiences, needs, and understandings of the world, it's also seen the profession collude with the apparatus of the state, such that social work cannot be seen as innocent of the historical abuses associated with colonialism. And both Wendy and Gallagher have mentioned the particular controversies in recent years around the treatment of Indigenous peoples in this respect. And our third excerpt, if you like, racialized, including Black and Indigenous scholars, are actively taking up how whiteness continues to organize social work theories, education, practice, in the field. For racialized scholars, critical education continues to be a dangerous terrain to navigate. For this paper, the spatial orientation of whiteness in the classroom in a time of coloniality is the unit of analysis. Again, a sort of broad-ranging analysis of colonialism based on the notion of whiteness as a way of organizing power and domination, applying itself to the theories and practices historically of social work. I suppose the question for all of us as scholars is where do we go from here? How can this history be useful to us? Indeed, in a sense, there is a tendency, perhaps an understandable tendency, to try and brush that history under the carpet, to say we're starting afresh. History is full of terrible things, but we've changed, so let's not mention it. The unit which I led for a number of years, Institute of Commonwealth Studies, has never had that approach to issues. It has always had at its core historical analysis. Indeed, some of its most distinguished directors over the years have been historians, like its first director, Keith Hancock, and in the 1980s, Schuller Marx. And the unit that I now lead, History and Policy, at the Institute of Historical Research, was founded in 2002 on the premise that history could assist in policy making, and indeed that policy making misses out if it's not conducted within a historical context. And it has done so through publishing over the years hundreds of policy papers, opinion articles, engaging particularly with trade unionists, members of the labour movement, and with government departments such as the Treasury and the Home Office. And so what I want to do, just in the few minutes I have at the beginning of this conference, is to think about the sorts of ways in which history can help us to clarify thoughts about the longer history of social work, in the sense how we draw positive resources and guidance from that history. And I want to draw some of these examples from a book published in 2011, edited by Bailey, Rao, Streeter, and Woolcock. And Simon Streeter was one of the founders of History and Policy back in 2002. Their opening chapter of this book, How and Why History Matters for Development Policy, is something of a kind of manifesto of how you use history in this way. And in a sense, development policy has a sort of similar trajectory to social work and social welfare policy in the Commonwealth. Starts to be a particular concern of colonial governments in the late colonial period and follows through into the independence period. And also, in many respects, some of the key aims, objectives, methods of development policy has been associated with the colonial project and with Western thinking. So the question is it useful now? How might it be useful? Has it been discredited? So what I want to do is to pluck out 10 broad ways in which history might be able to help us, and perhaps point to one or two examples of how that works. The first thing that history can do is help us to appreciate the context in which policy is devised and implemented. And particularly that generic policy models can have radically different outcomes when applied in different socioeconomic contexts. This helps us to problematize claims about the general applicability of particular policies, particularly when based on implicit or explicit claims about their success, drawing on historical precedents. You'll see often policy makers, politicians saying this policy has worked in Sweden or Sri Lanka during these periods of time. Historians want to go a little bit deeper into this and say, well, why did they work? Why did they work in that particular context? historians are interested in the particular. We find generalizations useful as organizing principles, but we also always want to kind of tease out their weaknesses and their limitations when applied to the specific. And I think this is an interesting and useful way in which we can sort of think within these comparative histories of social work across the Commonwealth. Understanding process, understanding how policies are carried out, but also taking away perhaps a general lesson, and this again is quoting directly from Wilcox, Streeter and Rao's introductory chapter. They talk about a substantive lesson from studies of process, which is that policies often result in a wide variety of different outcomes, some intended, some unintended. And conversely, the observed outcomes can themselves be a product of multiple factors: intended and unintended, observable, unobservable, known and unknown. We often these broad categories about colonialism, about imperialism, about whiteness, as though power operated without any kind of impediments. The policymakers, colonial policymakers, knew what they were doing and knew what the outcomes would be. We know that is broadly not the case across policy and policy making. Policies can have a wide variety of unintended outcomes. And I think in this conference, it'd be interesting to tease out some of those, if you like, unintended consequences of social work policy that we come across. Perhaps, short-circuiting the intentions not only of colonial governments, but of post-colonial governments across the Commonwealth. Thirdly, understanding how institutions have evolved. And Wilcox, Streeter and Rao talk about the characteristic of hybridity in terms of that development within a sort of colonial and post-colonial context. What do they mean by hybridity in that respect? Well, they say the variety of sources of ideas born of intense two-way interactions between colonies and rulers and others that coalesce to inform the distinctive content of institutions. These interactions characteristically emerge through a political process of contestation, and thereby have a content and legitimacy they would and could not have had if they'd been singularly imported from elsewhere. In this sense, even if the end state form of the institution in question happens to be similar to that of the one elsewhere, it will nonetheless be qualitatively different for having been forged through a domestic political process. So that's to say, we sometimes kind of assume that social work models are simply imported wholesale, imposed wholesale from outside. That may be true to an extent, but in the process of being embedded in particular local contexts, different forces work upon them to change them, to challenge them. And in that process of being modeled, perhaps those forms take on a greater legitimacy than they would have done because they have some local input, than had they simply been dumped on those places wholesale. I think we want to think about that in the course of the conference. And let me just give an example. I'm going to give two examples from the journal that I edit, the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History. A couple of pieces that have been published recently, which touch on this. This piece by Kate Skinner from 2011 talking about the way in which, in the early 1960s, Ghana's independence leader, Kwame Nkrumah, rather than, I suppose, discarding the apparatus of the colonial state in the area of social and welfare policy, valued that knowledge and valued that link with the local community, to the extent that he wanted to use that, to repurpose that for his own project of forging socialism in Ghana. So in a sense, he regarded that knowledge, that those processes, as legitimate and valuable. Through, I think, the process that we've described above of hybridization within Ghana. Fourthly, and very basically, what history allows us to think about is who is important, who is actually driving policy. Is it the policymakers themselves? Are there popular movements? Are there forces, again, of contestation, which are key in actually producing the policy outcomes that we see in history? Fifthly, mapping exchanges. We often talk about a sort of core and periphery model in colonial and Commonwealth history. The implication being that ideas and processes are simply transmitted in one direction from the metropolitan core to the colonial periphery. I think in history we're interested more in a sort of two-way process of exchange, that ideas don't necessarily follow one particular direction, even within a colonial context. And again, the second of these articles from the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, one by Barbara Bush on social research and social sciences at the end of empire, looking specifically at the West Indian social survey, which was conducted in 1946 to 49. And looking in this case at the career of Dr. Madeleine Kerr, who was a researcher from Bedford College, University of London, who was employed in this survey. One of the things that the piece picks out is that in her later career, Kerr conducted a study of white families of Irish descent in inner city Liverpool, using some of the processes, the methodologies, personality testing that she had applied in the West Indies, and coming to similar conclusions, establishing clear similarities between the deprived people of Jamaica and Ship Street in Liverpool in terms of family structure, matriarchality, sex, and marriage, superstition, and religion. In comparing Jamaica and Liverpool, Kerr views class, culture, and race, and arguably revealed middle-class prejudices that condemn both the poor working class and colonized peoples for moral inadequacy. So I think there are two things going on here. One can see the sort of transmission in both directions between metropolitan core and colonial periphery of ideas around society and social work, not just in one direction. And secondly, that perhaps our contemporary concentration on race misses other factors in the narrative, particularly class and class prejudices within these contexts. Six, very briefly, tracking trends. History can, by taking a longer term perspective, can track changes in social attitudes, which will inevitably have an impact on the success or failure of particular attitudes in social work policy, and may explain why certain policies are prevalent and fashionable at a particular moment in time. And on that question of time spans, understanding how policy plays out over much longer periods of time, not quite the periods of the dinosaurs, but within, I suppose, modern history, much longer periods of time than policymakers usually deal in. Increasingly, policymakers are in post for maybe 2 or 3 years before moving on to other jobs. They lack this broader sense of how policy plays out in the longer term. And again, it would be interesting to think about this in the context of our comparative cases today and tomorrow. Eighthly, and this is, I think, really important, particularly in terms of thinking about the treatment of indigenous peoples, marginalized peoples. What history can and increasingly has done in recent years is uncover suppressed or marginalized histories that can be drawn upon for insights in policy making. And I quote here an article about social work education and encouraging empowerment amongst people of African descent. And this is drawing backwards in time, perhaps further than we will go over the next couple of days, but I think it's worth quoting. The author says, cultural accounts of histories and narratives around survival, development, migration, and problem solving may provide hope, inspiration, and meaning making that may serve liberatory functions. Critical exploration of how enslaved Africans and Africans on the continent have resisted and coped with slavery and colonialism can reveal certain culturally relevant attributes that can support thriving and thus be applied to inform indigenous social work practices in Africa with people of African descent. Ninthly, investigating policies that were either not pursued and or abandoned. Again, historians immerse themselves in the kind of the deep history, the detailed history of particular policy initiatives. And it's always interesting to see the options that weren't pursued or were pursued and then abandoned for certain reasons, and try and tease out of them what might have been valuable in those policies and what could be applied in the future. And finally, I think one of the things that historians can bring to the policy making process in general is what I might call stress testing of policies. It's perhaps a mistake to think that historians deal purely in fact. Of course we do, but we use facts and we use evidence from a variety of different sources to construct a kind of imaginative recreation of the past, so that we can think our way into people in the past policymakers, and inhabit the world, see the world through their eyes. And that, I think, imaginative process can help us in our interactions with policymakers and practitioners. Imagining what the outcomes of policies might be, thinking about past precedents and saying, have you thought about this? Could this go wrong in that way? If it went wrong in that way, could you do this? So, in a sense, stress testing policies. And we often know that policies are introduced, their negative outcomes are perhaps predictable, but aren't thought enough about or followed through. So those are 10 broadly conceptual ways in which we might be able to use history to think about how social work policy goes forward, and that's our main concern, I think. And I'll come back to some of those ideas as we go through the different panels today. But thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Philip, for taking us through those 10 points and illustrating why it is so important that we have this sort of process, this attempt to look at history, and to do so reflecting on social policy and all the historical trends and historical tools of analysis, which Philip has mentioned. And that can really help us to understand where we come from, but also where we're going. And Wendy talked earlier about improvements in social policy. And I know from her experience in the Cabinet Office, she would have watched politicians saying that they focus on evidence, but actually reacting in the short term to immediate pressures. And how social work has been at the receiving end of some of those chopping and changing. I'll touch on some of that when I talk about the regulation of social work at the very end of this morning. But Philip, thank you very much indeed for your scene setting. It's really given us a breadth of understanding of the task ahead of us.